In this episode of Restore It, I make some more slow but steady progress on the E30. As I've said in a previous episode, this is going to be a lot of work, but I didn't know the true meaning of that statement until now. This is so much work. Even just extracting the rear quarter panels from the donor car and getting them ready is a huge project in itself. Don't get me wrong, I love a challenge. I just feel like there aren't enough hours in the day to do as much as I'd like to, probably because I've taken on way too much at once. Speaking of which, the Mercedes is almost back together and out of the workshop, so stay tuned for the big final episode of that and get ready for more frequent and longer E30 episodes. I also plan to do the odd antique every now and again with the free time I'll get not having the Mercedes here. Coming back to this episode, I get the first donor quarter panel ready for welding and I remove the second one from the chassis. I also check the chassis for bends and come up with a plan to brace it after speaking with an expert. And finally, I start the long journey of welding the chassis back to life. So before I start stripping this quarter panel, I want to quickly tell you about EmanualOnline. These are factory style workshop repair manuals for the BMW E30. This is exactly what technicians use at dealerships when they need to carry out work on customers' cars. Step-by-step instructions with pictures and talk specs covering everything you need to know about a particular vehicle. And they'll also tell you if you need special tools or equipment. These manuals will show you how to do practically any job you can think of. And better still, you can get a manual for almost any car in existence. I've put a link down in the description if you want to check it out. These things are usually only $20, but I'm going to leave a discount code down there for 30% off your entire order. You can download all of your manuals to any computer and have it for the rest of your wrenching life. They hold invaluable information that can save you a ton of money and give you the knowledge and confidence to do jobs like this at home. Big thanks to EmanualOnline for sponsoring this episode and helping people like you and me to better understand our cars. Let's get back to the rear quarter. So the idea here is to remove any and all coatings from this panel, so I can see if there is any hidden rust, which will then be removed. This process will also make sure that the panel is properly prepared to take Novol's anti-corrosion weld-through primer. The paint stripper I applied at the end of the last episode did almost nothing. I used to use Starcham Synstrip, a much more powerful paint stripper, but the company I used to buy it from is no longer legally allowed to post it because it's such a dangerous chemical. I think I'll have to find somewhere to pick it up in person, as it really would have saved me a lot of time. The paint stripper I'm using here is called TX10. Not the worst, but certainly not the best. With a brand new blade in a Colad scraper, I'm making some progress, but the paint is still mostly attached. The underseal on the bottom of the panel couldn't care less about the paint stripper, and so I removed most of it with the blade. The paint was coming off, but it was taking an absolute age. I was also seeing rust underneath, seemingly good bits of metal. So it was at this point that I switched to steel wire bits on a Sealy air die grinder. This made light work of what paint was left over. Some of the old trim clips need to be tapped out and thrown away as they're both broken. It's nice to finally see some good metal underneath all of that mess. It's moments like this that keep me going. This process is achieving two things. It's removing the paint, but we can also start to see the work that's going to be needed. Any metal that's too thin will just give way. Continuing on, I'm going to speed through this as fast as possible without missing too much. I frequently checked the panel's temperature to make sure it wasn't getting hot at all, to be absolutely sure there was no warping taking place. Slowly but surely, the rust and old factory paint came off. This bumper bracket and bolt were so stuck, I decided to just cut them off. The undersill was the only bit left before my camera died, but once that was gone, we can see just how much damage there really is. But no, being serious, there actually isn't that much damage, and the areas where there is damage, I have the patch panels needed for the repairs, minus the wheel arch lip kit. I didn't blast the entire panel as I didn't want to warp it. However, on sections like this, all of the bends and different shapes make warping it quite difficult. So I'm going to shot blast them to remove the hard to reach rust and then go back over with steel bits to polish the surface. Once the outer pieces were done, I flipped it over and focused on the rear side, which is where I found most of the rust. I'm going to do as much blasting as I can get away with because it's so much quicker than doing it with steel wire bits or a sanding disc. And there we go, pretty much rust free apart from some well hidden rust that you'll see in a second. Minus the section of tail panel, upper boot lid and a few holes, this is finally starting to look similar to a real replacement panel. There is a fair amount of welding work needed to get this perfect, but once it's done and ready to go on, this will be a huge piece in the puzzle sorted. Moving on, the final bit of factory coating needed to be removed and the metal beneath it prepped for the primer. I'm glad I chose to completely strip these down and not settle on the factory coatings that looked like they were alright, because this rust is hiding under what looks like completely healthy and protected metal. I was quite shocked to see this and can't think of what's causing it. Maybe the coating is just failing after all of these years. Who knows? If you do, please do let me know down in the comments. I set about removing all of the paint as well as all of the rust with the die grinder. And just like that, it was shiny. As you can see here, if I remove the inner arch from the outer, there's not much of the outer arch left, and taking into account the other damage along it that the patch panel will also replace, I think I'm going to cut as much of the inner off as I can to make the outer repair as simple as possible. I had to be very careful not to cut through to the quarter panel, but in the end I managed without doing so. Once that was done, I gave the spray booth a quick clean as this is a seriously messy job. With all of the rust gone from the areas I'm keeping, I can now clean the panel and prepare it for primer. After removing the obvious metal dust, I moved to a tack cloth to really get all of the dust and dirt off. I then wiped the entire panel down with silicone remover. This is a specific requirement when using Novo's bodywork primer. Any and all contaminants must be removed. Once that had flashed off completely, I sprayed the first of 2 coats to the inside. I really should service my spray gun. The fan setting is currently broken, so I can either have full fan or a dot. To get the paint down, I've opted for the dot. Not ideal, but it's working. This primer is touch dry in 15 minutes. And it dries matte, which really helps you see what's going on compared to a glossy finish. This is just one coat and you can see how uniform it is. I wish I had found this stuff sooner as it would have saved me hours of work. And the fact that it's weldable is such a bonus, as you'll see later on in this episode. With that dry, I can now flip it over and coat the outside. Actually, before I do that, I need to remove these old stickers that, like the undersill, did not care one bit about that paint stripper. With those off, I sort of realised that I had neglected this area before I flipped it over, so I spent a little bit of time with a few different steel wire bits stripping and cleaning the surface. Now, with every inch dealt with, I can clean and paint this side. And there we go, the first of 2 coats are done. According to the datasheet, the coat should start wet and glossy and finish matte, which is what's happening, so I think we're all good. Again, it's now so much easier to see what's going on, and overall I'd say this is a really good panel. A few spots here and there to repair, but I think even if I didn't have to change the entire quarter panel, I'd still have had to do repairs like this anyway, so I don't feel too bad about having to do all this work. This is such a satisfying thing to see after all the work that's gone into it. And it's funny when I think about it, all of this work was getting it ready to be able to get it ready, if that makes sense. Now it's in this state, it's ready for quite a lot of welding work, so you'll be seeing a lot more of this panel in the coming episodes. Changing the subject, kind of, the other quarter panel is still attached to the car. So to get this nasty job out of the way, I thought I'd just grab the grinder and get it done. Before any cutting took place, I made sure to save as many parts as possible. Sadly, this aerial fixing wasn't one of them. I used a standard grinder and a cutting disc and slowly made it up as I went along. Every now and again I'd switch to the air saw for a few sections which were hard to get to, and that made life a lot easier. This truly is a horrible job. It doesn't feel right cutting up an E30 like this, and it's also really noisy and really filthy. It's just not a nice job. Would you just look at how sad this E30 looks? The panel got stuck on a section I couldn't get to for a while, but in the end it was free. And it was at this point the reality hit me that I'll be doing everything I've just done on this first panel to the second one. I'm not sure if I'll show you the second one being stripped and prepped, as it's all a bit samey, but let me know down in the comments either way. Coming back to the chassis itself for a bit, a few people have mentioned to me that the chassis could be bent in a number of ways. One, because I didn't brace it before putting it on the rotisserie, and especially two, because all of the panels that have now been removed at once. And to those people I say, yes, you're probably right. So with this in mind, I started doing some research into jigging and factory specifications and all that sort of stuff. And in the process, came across a guy called John from Advanced Auto Accident Repair. We got chatting, and John, the absolute legend, helped me understand how to undo any bending that may have happened whilst the chassis is still on the rotisserie. And he's also provided me with the proper factory drawings, which I can check my chassis against and make the necessary adjustments. Once it's 100%, I'll brace the entire thing with long bits of box section welded in place. I just want to give a big thank you to John from Advanced Auto Accident Repair for taking the time to help me out. So I need to buy a few bits and make up an adjustable jig of sorts, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Not in this episode, but possibly the next or the one after that, as this is quite an important thing to get right before I do any welding. One of the first panels I'll need to attach is the sill or rocker panel, and this is where I had some confusion. As you can see, these two don't match. That's because this panel from E30 Garage Norway is designed to be used as a patch panel and not a complete replacement. In my case, the original panel was so rusty the workshop in Spain decided to remove it, thinking I had a factory replacement panel. So when I came to align everything temporarily, it just didn't add up. That was when I realised I needed to buy two of these panels. Thankfully, these are still available from BMW at around £240. Once I get two of these, it will negate the need for this E30 Garage Norway patch panel. Well, most of it anyway, as I still need the rear of it to repair the bottom of the quarter panel. You can see on the side that we took the first quarter panel from that it's spot welded to the inner rocker panel of the chassis, and the rear quarter panel is then spot welded over the top of it where it starts to get thinner. One of the things John told me to do to get a rough idea of the state of the chassis was to reattach the door and the old quarter panel to check the gaps and see how things line up. So to just make sure it's not completely and utterly out of whack, I'm going to do just that. Annoyingly, the only two panels that were damaged in transit on the way back from Spain were the doors. I think they're savable. A few taps with a hammer should see these straight, but we'll come to that in a later episode. For now, I'm just going to see if they still fit on the car. Attaching the rear quarter panel with some vice grips was pretty easy, but fitting a door on my own was a bit more of a challenge. With a bit more improvising, I got there in the end. Everything seems to be exactly where it was before it went on the rotisserie, but I can't be sure until I have the factory drawings and start measuring. I will say, I'm pleased it's not obviously out of alignment, but I'm sure it is a bit, so it'll be good to make sure it's definitely straight once I have all the gear I need. Although I can't do any major welding, there's still a lot of tidying up that needs to be done before I can even start thinking about anything major. The bottom lip of these inner rocker panels have taken quite the beating, what with the removal of the outer and by being put on and off of a pallet. In this next section, I'm going to straighten the panel and replace all of the bits that are too weak to accept weld. Before I can do any welding, I need to remove the underseal on the back side of the panel. Using a pair of linesman pliers, I bent the metal back into position. I'll come back to this rear corner later. For now, I'm going to start on these holes and work forward. You can see where the old spot welds were ground down to remove the old rusted panel. My approach here is, if I can bridge weld it, good. If not, replace it with new 1.2mm steel. Does anyone else get this? Terrible welds right next to good welds. I just don't get it sometimes. good penetration on both, but one is so much neater than the other. The sort of welding I want to do is the type of welding that will make people think that no welding has even taken place, which is why I like butt welding and making sure the welds are properly flattened. As always, I use the finger sander and a flat disc on the grinder to flatten the welds completely. I currently only have a tiny bit of Novol bodywork primer left, so I'm brushing it on as soon as the welding is finished to maintain protection. So far, bridge welding has sufficed, but it was around this part where it was just too thin and I start adding in bits of fresh metal. These are small patches, but because the damage isn't rust, the metal becomes its full thickness quite quickly after you move away from the centre of the damage. This is a really heavily edited and cut down version of the real thing. I'm making this look easy, but what you're not seeing is all of the faffing around behind the scenes, fixing unexpected issues and all that sort of thing that really takes up the majority of the time. Annoyingly, I knocked this piece without realising and then couldn't tell through the welding mask that it was slightly off. I genuinely may have to go back and redo this piece. This section is the most affected area, and so I decided to do it all in one go. I slightly misjudged the gap on this one and was worried about not getting a good enough weld. So instead of removing it and reshaping the piece, I cut a line where the two pieces meet to make a good enough gap to weld. I'm going to remake the little cutout at the bottom once all of the welds are flattened. To get the correct shape, I'm going to use a different one as a stencil. With the markings made, I can now cut it out using the air saw and a cutting disc. And there we go, looking like it should once again. There aren't many more to go now, and looking back at what's done so far, it's looking much better. This is the last bit that needs replacing towards the front. For some reason, I didn't immediately clock that the gas needed to be turned up. I eventually realised, and by the time I did, the camera had died and it was all welded up. With all of that done, I headed to the back of the panel to deal with the rear corner. Firstly, all of that undersill needed to go. Now this is rust damage, so I'm going to cut quite a large section out to make sure the metal is full thickness. With the rusted metal gone, the new piece was made and tacked in, ready to weld. Once welded, it was just a case of grinding and protecting. And there we go, the final piece of this inner rocker is done. Although seemingly insignificant, this was a good warm up for me before the more important jobs come. I'm really pleased with how neat and tidy it now is, and it's ready for a brand new outer rocker panel. I need to get my hands on one of those large spot welders. If I do, I'll grind the backs of these welds to make sure it can do its job properly. But if I don't get one, I probably won't grind them down and leave them there for strength, as they won't be seen once they're covered in undersill. If anyone knows where I can get one of those tools from, do let me know down in the comments, because I think it would save me a massive amount of time. I'll be going over all of these welds to make sure there are no pinholes, but for now there seems to be good penetration and only a few fires that I didn't know about, so that's definitely something to be more careful with going forward. And that's all we have time for this week, folks, but as always, thanks very much for joining me, and I look forward to bringing you the next one. Cheers.